So one thing to mention here, we talked about the server application and the SC server app. However, I do want to mention that Hoops Converter is technically a server component. We're not going to talk much about it in this module because we talked about it in the authoring module. But Converter is a native application that we use to author the data into the system. Now, it supports these large number of file formats. And one thing we do want to talk about Converter, and we will see this more when we look at the case study, but it's important you want to separate out Hoops Converter from your web and viewing servers. The reason being is that conversion of models is going to be very resource intensive. It's going to use lots of memory, lots of processor resources. So we don't want that conversion process running on the same server that's going to be doing streaming of other models. If we do that, what will happen is we'll get this competition for resources, and the streaming experience will degrade significantly while we're doing conversions. So this may make our life a little more complicated because we now have multiple machines responsible for this process. But when we look at the case study and a little bit later in the lectures, we'll see how we handle storing of files and accessing of files amongst different machines. So that's all I'm going to talk about for Converter at this point, but we do want to remember that this is a server component running in our environment, and we do want to keep that separated from the viewing. Okay, so back to server. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the server application. All right, so the one thing we want to kind of take away from this server is that we have one server application running per server instance. So what does this mean? So if we were just serving 1, 2 users, or maybe even 10 users, we can get away with having just one single viewing server. Okay, but the problem is that when we support maybe hundreds of users, we're going to have multiple servers running. And every time we have a server running, we're also going to have a copy of the Hoops server application running on each one of those servers. And the reason we do this is, if you think back to what we talked about, we're going to be spawning processes to facilitate the viewing of these files. And the way we do that is through a REST API. Okay, and we have the REST API for spawning processes and querying the state of the system. So all the communication with the server is done via REST in this agnostic way, so that anyone can talk to the system, no matter where they're coming from. Now, the server has 3 sort of components that are running inside it. It has a service broker, and the service broker is the one that's going to actually be receiving these responses and creating the processes. Now, we also have an event log, which is going to provide you a list of events that happen in the system. So every time we spawn a process, we'll make a note in the event log. If for whatever reason a process may crash, we can detect that, and that'll be noted in the event log. So basically, if you're having problems, you're going to want to look at the event log to see sort of what's going on. And finally, we have the process manager, and the process manager is responsible for keeping an eye on these streaming processes that we've launched to make sure that they're in a healthy state. So if things go awry or something crashes, the process manager will be the one to detect that. So let's take a quick look here at how we can query the state of the system. So I'm going to jump over here. So here I have a status page from a local copy of the server that I'm running. And there's a couple things we want to note here. So we can see right now we have a couple of components. We can see our event log, we can see 2 process managers. So the event log is just another process that's running, and we can look and see what's going on. So if we click on here on the log, we can see that we've started up 2 other processes, which is these 2 process managers. And as we create more streaming sessions, when they start and information about them will appear in this event log. Likewise, if we look at the process managers, each of these have their own log file as well, and they will have additional information. So we can query each individual process to see additional information about it. And this page just kind of provides an overview of what that looks like. Now, if we were to launch some viewing sessions, we would see them appear here as well. So if I was to go into our package and launch a new session, we now have our model, and if we go back to our status and reload, we can see now we have this SC CSR process. Now this is the streaming session I just started, and this now appears in our overview. So we can kind of get a live feed of the system as it's being used. And if we look back in our event log, we can see that we started a stream cache here. That's been noted. And if we look in the process manager, we can also see the process ID and the command line options that were used to spawn this. So for example, if you encountered some sort of crash or something, this would be a good place to look and see what the system was trying to do when we spawned the process. So that's the server components sort of visual user interface. So one thing I want to talk about is settings files. So the system is configured through a series of settings files. So the server has its own settings file, and the streamers have their own settings file. And in general, settings files contain the generic settings for each component. Now, when you are spawning them, you can override some of these settings. So for example, you remember when we looked at the integration samples, there was a way to set additional directories that the system can search for models. So there are a number of settings that you can specify when you create these processes to override what's in the settings files or supplement them. But the settings files provide a base settings for these applications, so you don't have to specify everything every time. And these settings files are automatically generated by the service broker, which we'll look at in a little bit.